Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you, and this time I'm talking about episode 16 of season 1 of Green Lantern, the animated series called Steam Lantern. Now, when I heard about the name of this episode and read the basic description of Hal being thrown into a steampunk universe, generally I was extremely skeptical of this episode, but the truth is, I ended up really liking this episode. This is easily one of my favorites of the season so far. It's it's simply a fun episode, and there's nothing wrong with that. I of course love all the really dramatic stuff, the mythology of Green Lantern that we've gotten to see in this episodes. I'm sorry, in this season. But at the end of the day, comics are meant to be fun. They're meant to be full of all kinds of weird, crazy ideas, and this is one of those things. It's a perfect example of that. Is let's throw a standard superhero into a steampunk universe and let him meet a steampunk version of himself in a way. I mean, that's totally awesome. So let's kind of get into it in a little bit more detail. This is very reminiscent of what we're looking at here on this alternate world of what DC used to do with their Elseworld comics, and those are sort of DC's version of Marvel's What If, except the majority of them tended to be very, very out there. It's not like what if Batman had gone left instead of gone right in a story, although they did do those a few of those tales. They were mostly very, very different, very out there takes. For example, one of my favorites was a Superman Elseworlds called Cal, where Superman's rocket lands on Earth, except it's in the Dark Ages and he lands in England. So it's sort of what if Superman grew up in the time of Camelot. There was another one that I read that was a Batman story set in Renaissance Italy. There was sort of a Conan the Barbarian Catwoman story where Catwoman was literally a Catwoman, and just all kinds of really, really crazy stuff. And some of them worked better than others, but they were definitely quite a lot of fun. And this is, again, as I said, very reminiscent of. Well, no, it's not reminiscent. It is a flat out steampunk universe that we're dealing with here, or at least the planet that we see in that universe. Uh, Now, I'm not going to be claim to be a great expert on steampunk, but it's something I've have a passing familiarity with, and I think it's a very enjoyable genre. I think it's got something that comes with quite a bit of charm, quite a bit of fun, and they definitely really channel the energy of what I think makes steampunk enjoyable, at least for me. And I won't lie, I definitely got a big kick out of Catherine's line about it's not all wine and hoses here. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous joke, but it's something that seems incredibly fitting for that universe, that planet that we're on. And forgive me if I kind of bounce back between planet and universe. But anyway, we of course have the three main characters we meet there are Catherine, the Steam Lantern. I think his name was Gil Guy or something like that, and the Duke. Now, what really surprises me is that even though they all have very little screen time, they really do manage to give us a good sense of these characters. We have Gil, who wants to be seen as a true hero, even though he really, as far as he's concerned, is a fraud. And it's true. He took credit for something he didn't do. Catherine is, she's really a background character to some degree, but she is presented to us as being a very strong, very capable person, a very moral person, a very intelligent woman. She's really going out there and being the person who has no powers, but is not afraid to stand up for the little people. And then we even have the Duke, the guy who did literally make a deal, almost literally made a deal with the devil in order to save his world, and then became lost in that. Now, and since he's, I think, the most interesting out of these three characters, let's actually talk about the Duke briefly. First of all, the idea of him being able to negotiate a deal with the Monitor doesn't really ring particularly true to me, given what we know of the Anti-Monitor, and I'll talk about him in a minute. But what the heck, right? I mean, if Reed Richards can get to talk to Galactus, then okay, I can swing it. I can buy it that the Duke can get the Anti-Monitor to sit down and listen to him. Now, the whole thing about him saying that he built those those enforcer robots, or whatever the heck he actually called them, so that he could keep people appraised on what's happening. Okay, that to me makes absolutely no sense. Now look at those things. They have what is literally a TV in their chests. So if they have that, if they have freaking TV, why don't you just invent TVs? People can, put them in their homes, in bars, in the streets, and you could keep people informed that way without having to build mechanical machines to go out and beat up anybody who doesn't like what's going on in society, so that you could throw them into a workhouse. Now, granted, I'm once again, doubtlessly overanalyzing this. I mean, we do only have 22 minutes within which to have this story told and to really get a sense of these characters and what's going on. So, of course, things by necessity have to be greatly, greatly simplified. I mean, maybe there is a legitimate reason why the Duke didn't do that. In fact, I've read two interesting books by a fellow by the name of Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Collapse, and they're all basically about why certain civilizations rise, why they fall, why certain cultures embrace technological change and others don't, and it's all actually quite fascinating stuff. So, and sometimes what it all amounts to is that cultures, for reasons that might seem strange to us, choose not to, say, adopt a new technology. But they always do so for a reason. They don't just do it because they're dumb or something like that. There are reasons for why people do these things. It just is often things that are just simply not immediately apparent to us. And given the circumstances those people find themselves in, actually, if you are willing to dig, do start to make sense for their society. One of the great examples they give on this is why in certain cultures, for example, it's considered acceptable to eat, horse meat. Like, horse meat is considered something of a delicacy in France, while in the United States, if you were to talk about eating a horse, people would kind of look at you funny. But, I'm getting way off track here, so let's continue on with the story of talking about the Duke's character. Now, what I do like is that he's not presented as a straight-up villain. When it is unquestionably pointed out to him just how far he's taken it, how he has gone so wrong. He even says, like, oh my god, you're right, I am the villain. And he immediately does a 180 and starts helping out the heroes. Now, this seems like a conveniently fast 180, but again, we're only dealing with 22 minutes here, and it's really not the story of Hal versus the Duke and all this stuff. There's much, much, much more going on. So, by necessity, they kind of have to cut to the chase. And, you know what? Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad in storytelling. And there is no exact formula for when it's good and when it's bad. It really is just a case-by-case basis, and of course, as always, a matter of personal preference. For this episode, I can give it a pass. They do enough with the characters in the alternate planet to make them seem real enough, even if it is very, very done very briefly. They literally do not waste a minute with any of the three characters that we deal with on that world. And that being the case, they're able to do enough with them to sell me on those characters. And honestly, I just like the fact that the Duke turned out to not really be a bad person in the end. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a character who's a straight-up villain, but characters who are nuanced, who are willing to realize when it is that they have done wrong, when they have crossed the line, those are far, far richer characters. And that's something that I really well and truly love. Now look at Gil. He was forced to admit that he really was a fraud. And, of course, to his girlfriend, it looks like he was just being forced to say this stuff because the bad guy wanted to make him look like a chump. But the fact that Gil was willing to do that, to sacrifice his image, what he thought would be the trust the people had placed in him, in order to save his friends, that sacrifice is what really makes him a true hero. And it was very heartening, I found, to see that the people were willing to just look past that because of all the things that he had done in addition, what he had really done to help them. He had stood up for them when they needed someone to stand up for them. And that, and his willing to sacrifice, is what made Gil a true hero. I've already said everything I really think I have to say about Catherine. So let's move on to what's going on with Hal this episode. And again, we see more of Hal being the true hero. Once again, he's willing to sacrifice himself in order to save people. He's willing to sacrifice his one chance to get home if that means he can help people who desperately need him. And what I really love about this, of course, is at the end that Hal finds that solution where he is able to save everyone. And he does so in an absolutely spectacular fashion. It's the kind of superheroic stuff that really makes superheroes so great. The sort of things that make you want to get up and cheer. I mean, if this was something they'd put in the Green Lantern movie, this sort of storytelling had been in the live action Green Lantern movie, that would have been a blockbuster. I mean, really, this is like the end of a great movie where you do just want to stand up and cheer for the heroes because they've saved the day. And you really can't ask for much more than that, especially from a show that's only 22 minutes long. Now, let's get into some of the other aspects of what we're dealing with here. First of all, I remember at the end where Gil mentions that they had met. No, it wasn't at the end. They mentioned previously that there was another Green Lantern that they'd met, and that he wore a red shirt and had a cape. Now, I'm actually a little embarrassed that I had to stop and think about that for a second before it hit me who it was they were talking about. And, of course, they're talking about Alan Scott. Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern, created way back in the 30s. Now, Alan Scott has always had kind of a weird relationship with the mainstream Green Lantern Corps, Green Lantern cast. He is, of course, considered to be a Green Lantern. He was the first superhero to call himself Green Lantern. But given his reaction to what we've heard, I would say that Alan Scott is the Green Lantern of the universe where this steampunk planet comes from. That their version of Earth. Because it seemed, now I could be wrong on that, but if there'd been another Green Lantern running around Earth, decades before he was born, you can't help but think that Hal probably would have heard about that. Now, again, we don't know that for sure, but that does seem like the most likely situation. But in any case, I really think that means that, yeah, sometime later this season, we're going to get to see Alan Scott. I mean, how awesome is that? Now, granted, Alan Scott's powers were eventually explained simply to be magic rather than the science that powers the normal Green Lantern Corps batteries. But again, we're dealing with a character, the Anti-Monitor, whose total thing is, messing around in alternate universes. So the idea of Alan Scott, some kind of alternate reality Green Lantern coming over to the main Green Lantern universe, yeah, that would make sense. That would be a workable way to introduce him into the show. And frankly, I think it would just be really cool. Now, one other thing I want to say before we move on to talking about the Anti-Monitor, as I promised. First of all, I have to say, it's incredibly convenient that they were able to bring the alternate world to a point in space that, what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It's close enough to a star to support life, and gravity is all just the right proportions to allow an Earth-like planet to be there without any trouble. Now, if you stop and think about what we really saw there, the science on it just doesn't even begin to make sense in any way. But there being an alien planet out there full of steampunk British people, that doesn't make any sense either. But really, there is no scientific way to justify anything like that. It's just one of those things that you just have to run with. And I don't really have a problem with that. And I certainly, before I finish or move on to Anti-Monitor, I definitely want to give a little bit of a nod to the character design for Steam Lantern. I thought it was really very cool, very very simple, but it worked. It actually reminded me an awful lot of the costume worn by the Great Machine character from the Ex Machina comics by Brian K. Vaughan. If you've ever heard of him, in addition to being a very well acclaimed comic book writer, creator of Runaways, one of my favorite books in a long, long time, he was also a writer on Lost. And Ex Machina is kind of his creator-owned thing that he got to be quite well known for, and it's really a very, very good series. And yeah, it's one of the really great takes on what a superhero would be like in the real world. So if you're looking for some good comics, definitely hunt up Ex Machina and Runaways and give it a shot sometime. But anyway, let's talk about the big baddie we're dealing with here, and that is, of course, the Anti-Monitor. Now, we saw him last episode, and I said that I wanted to hold off until a little later on so that, well, basically we could get the characters in the show to do the exposition. But yes, the Anti-Monitor. One of, maybe not the most prominent DC villains, but in some ways the most terrifying. And the short version of it is, of course, that he is the guy who was behind the Crisis on Infinite Earths. And if you're not really up on your comic book history, basically DC for a long time had this entire multiverse of alternate Earths that basically explain why they had so many different versions of these characters running around for years and years. And basically in 1986, they said, okay, this is just getting out of hand. This is too confusing to keep straight. We're going to basically wipe the slate clean. We're going to combine all these Earths into one reality and start the DC universe fresh from there. But of course, they can't just chuck everything out the window. So they had to tell a story to explain how this new DC universe is born. And that story was Crisis on Infinite Earths. And the main bad guy of that was the Anti-Monitor. And it is just as he said. He was a guy who essentially fed on destroying universes. And ultimately, he ended up taking the super beings of 6 different universes to take him down. And even then, they didn't really succeed. All they succeeded was in stopping him from destroying all reality. All those alternate Earths still ended up being merged together into what became known as the DC universe for well over 20 years. But, again, I don't want to drown people who aren't fans of the comics in too much history. But suffice to say, in terms of villains with power in the DC universe, even Darkseid does not top the power of the Anti-Monitor. He is literally the most powerful and greatest threat in the entire DC universe. And the Crisis on Infinite Earth is still, to this day, the gold standard of major crossovers in comic books. So, to geeky folks, fans of comic books like myself, having the Anti-Monitor invoked or show up in a story it's big. It is insanely big. And now here he is being used as a foe for the Green Lantern Corps. Now keep in mind, in the comics, it took the super beings of 6 universes to take this guy down. And this time around, it looks like it's going to fall entirely on the shoulders of the Green Lantern Corps. To say that Hal and the guys have their work cut out for him is a profound, profound understatement. But I'm so looking forward to the rest of this season. I think we're going to see some stuff that is just going to blow our minds. And with that said, folks, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.